Hey, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm very excited to be here virtually with you all at the ng-conf. We're going to be talking today about how to future-proof your company by effectively scaling engineering teams. Before we get into that, I want to introduce myself. My name is Jennifer Wadella. I can be followed on Twitter at @OMGIt'sFetty. I am the director of Angular development at a consulting company called Patovi. So I spend a lot of time consulting with enterprise clients, hearing about the problems that y'all encounter, not only on the Angular code side, but just in the how to organize software teams and how to better deliver software. So a lot of that will be the inspiration of this talk today. I'm also an Angular GDE, and when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, an international speaker. These days, I spend a lot of time speaking to my Zoom camera. It's super fun. And then I also, on the side, enjoy brewing kombucha and being a crazy plant lady. I just bottled some red bell pepper kombucha, so I'm excited to have some of that when it's ready in a couple days. So before we start this talk, I want to give kind of a little disclaimer here that there's going to be some tough love here. I'm not going to pull any punches. I'm going to hit you with some hard truths, and you might have to kind of look at your thinking or the way that your organization is doing things and start to think about making some changes. So just want to call that out that, nothing's going to be sugar-coated. This is the way things are, and if you want to continue to scale and grow teams in the ways that you think will make your company successful, I hope you can take away some insights from this. All right, so let's talk about goals for this talk when we're talking about scaling engineering teams. One, I want to help you survive what I'm calling the senior hire frenzy. I want to talk about how to improve your interview process. I want to touch on how to quickly spot skill gaps. And then finally, I want to talk about how to create a growth environment. I think a good understanding of all these things is going to set you up for success with scaling engineering teams. And so we'll kind of go through each of these topics and see why they matter. All right, so first of all, let's talk about the surviving the senior hire frenzy. Because I want to say you're probably feeling the pain, you're feeling the struggle of trying to get experienced enough engineers in the door, and it's not just you. I've been doing this, I've seen the effects of this for probably like at least the last 18 months now of just what the hiring market is like and what it's like trying to get competent senior developers, let alone competent senior Angular developers. So it's not just you. I do want to call out that, this is not just an Angular ecosystem problem. This is industry wide. There is a Facebook memo that got leaked from their internal recruiting team talking about their current hiring crisis, and they are getting a lot of their offers turned down. This quote, they only had just over 50% of their engineering offers accepted in the beginning of 2021. This is Facebook or Meta, excuse me. I still, not going to touch on that today. But anyway, if you look at what developers are looking for, typically the pinnacle of their career is working at one of these FANG companies. And if one of those companies is not even able to, meet their full hiring quotas, where does that leave everybody else? And there's not a lot that you can do. There's not a lot of money that you can continue to throw that's going to solve this problem. There's just not enough talent out there. So I want to kind of look at what came out in the Stack Overflow survey this year. Of course, this is not all encompassing at all. That being said, I feel like this does give you a good kind of estimate because it definitely reflects what I see. And so if you look at the question, this was answered, these are years coding professionally. And so if somebody is a full-time, software industry person, because this is DevOps, this is front end, this is back end, this is database, this is, sysadmins, everything. Most of our candidates here are 1 to 4 years of coding. And so this is a big deal in the Angular ecosystem, because if you look at somebody who started coding 4 years ago, they came in when we were already in framework wars. There are a lot of us who, have been writing JavaScript since the jQuery days, since, early frameworks like Backbone or Knockout. And so we understand the problems that we were trying to solve, and we understand, what these frameworks have built and offered us. And that means the second we run into a restrictive situation where maybe we need to have an understanding of, the DOM API, or how to manipulate things directly, or understand how, event bubbling works. We have that foundational knowledge. But somebody who came into the industry when frameworks were happening has had a lot of that knowledge obfuscated through our frameworks. And so they're coming in at a disadvantage in ability to problem solve the second something gets a little bit more complex, or the answers aren't, explicitly there offered by the framework. And so that's a big impact to the kind of experience we have coming in from people, and the way we need to be thinking about the kind of engineers that we're bringing in. And so not only do we have, a reduced number of people who have been in the industry for that long, but we've created a really big problem for ourselves in JavaScript. And when the framework wars started happening, we stopped hiring developers who didn't have production experience in frameworks. And so we created this terror among really competent JavaScript developers that if they're not on the latest and greatest framework, they won't be employable. And so that means the second something starts to tilt popularity-wise, they jump ship to make sure they will be employable. And so that means all these technologies that have been left behind, nobody wants to work in anymore because they're afraid they won't have job security. And we've done that to ourselves by, creating these checks in our hiring and recruiting processes. And so this was also the first year, according to Stack Overflow, that jQuery was surpassed. This is something not even AngularJS did as far as most used framework on the internet. It has now been surpassed by React.js. So you talk about experienced developers we have available. They don't necessarily look for Angular jobs. They're looking for React jobs because that's where they think they're going to be the most employable. So you're really, narrowing your scope. And so if you're asking yourself, okay, where are all the senior developers? They have to be out there somewhere. Where are they? Well, I'm going to say they're going to be in a couple different places. Number one, we've already discussed, is they've jumped ship for, another hot framework. And so this is a developer that they may have done work in Angular in the past. They're pretty experienced on the front end. They understand the problems that we're trying to solve, the situations we run into, how to deal with performance, how to deal with state management, and they've left for another framework. They might have gone this pathway where they were good, they were an architect, they were the most knowledgeable person, they got promoted into management, and they're smart, they have Angular experience, but they don't ship code anymore. Or you might have somebody in this category. This is probably a vast majority of the speakers at this conference, where they're in independent consulting and training. So they can help you in this capacity, but they're not in the market to, actually write code for you. So you're dealing with trying to recruit from a limited pool. And if you choose to wait in this pool, you have to understand that senior salaries may not necessarily get you senior talent, because at this point we're calling 3 to 4 years experience senior. That's kind of our idea, and that's where the industry has come to. And if you look at, a lot of developers, you can get away with 3 to 4 years of work on your resume without having written very much actual code. And so what is on their resume may not equate to actual production value when it comes to ability to write code. And this problem is only going to continue as frantic hiring continues. People can jump shop and salary bump, and they can do that every 6 months and never have produced a line of code. So this is what we're walking into. And then there's the fact that senior means something different everywhere. I've interviewed a lot of developers, and I've had seniors come in to me, and they're like, oh yeah, like I'm the most experienced one in Angular in my company. Like I'm the senior here. Everybody comes to me and I teach them how to use the CLI. And that's pretty much where their knowledge stops. They can't really answer any more specific questions about Angular's API. They don't really know how to implement forms. They've never heard of state management. But they're senior. They're the most senior person where they are. But their seniorness just happens to only encapsulate the very tip of the iceberg that is the Angular knowledge that we're looking for. And again, just because an applicant has built an application in Angular doesn't mean they know what they're doing. Like, yeah, they can make stuff work, but the amount of time I've walked into a client code base with an experienced Angular team and seen really scary things like manually calling ng on init everywhere and not understanding lifecycle hooks and just doing weird, perverse things that weren't intended to do. A lot of that is out there, and that's just going to, lead to technical debt. So big picture here is entering the senior hiring frenzy is not necessarily going to yield the results you're hoping for. I know everybody's like, oh, well, we can't take on junior engineers. We can't train people. We can only take seniors. there aren't enough seniors out there. And, if it comes down to me having to make a decision between taking a risk on a senior with 3 to 4 years on their resume who may not be able to produce a line of code versus a junior fresh out of boot camp who I know is eager for their first opportunity and is going to do what it takes to figure it out, I'm pretty much in the same boat, except one I know is passionate and excited, and one may just be bouncing around until the next opportunity comes along. It's really a crapshoot, and so I've been more heavily investing in junior candidates. And I would encourage you to consider doing the same instead of throwing senior salaries at people who will not be able to produce any more than a junior candidate could. All right. So if you're going to go ahead and you're like, oh, I don't care what you're saying, we're going to hire, I do want to give you a couple tips to improve your interview process. I feel like I have a lot of clients who come to us and maybe they've had Angular expertise in the past, or they want to bring development in shop, but they don't have anybody experienced enough to interview candidates and really assess their knowledge. So I want to give you a couple interview strategies, or maybe if you're just frustrated by your interview process and you feel like it's not yielding the results, give you a couple options that you could try. So we're going to talk about 3. Number 1 is the take-home code test, which is not my favorite, but if you are dealing with a lot of restrictions and you just need to get something out the door to help get started, it's there for you. Pair programming sessions are my favorite way to interview. And then the way I conduct interviews most often is a technique that I call building interview questions. All right, so if we look at a take-home test, the goal here is to have something completable in 30 minutes. It does not take that long to figure out whether somebody knows how to really produce quality Angular code or not. You want to make sure that you have clear requirements explained, like exactly what they want to do, because you want to not have them get hung up on that and be able to see how they write code and produce this. It's a good idea when you're thinking about what this code test should be to touch on a key area of your application needs. A lot of people use forms, and honestly, it's pretty fast to tell whether somebody is experienced enough to really understand the Angular Forms API, or if they have no idea and they just mash things together in a weird way or reinvent the wheel because they don't understand that. It's a pretty quick test. And I mean, honestly, 80 to 90% of the people I encounter have no idea how to competently execute on the Angular Forms API. So that's, low-hanging fruit. We see a lot of enterprise applications with heavy NGRX usage. So this is another thing where you can, describe some pretty clear requirements. You can even come up with situations that your team has maybe been bitten before in the past, and ask them to set, to execute on that, and should take less than 30 minutes, or you're going to tell pretty quickly, do they have NGRX experience or not? Or maybe, your team is doing a lot of reactive programming, and you just need to know whether they understand how to deal with, streams in RxJS or not. Again, this is very divisionary in Angular developers that you're going to see out there. Either they know how to do reactive programming and they can figure things out, or it's just like deer in the headlights. They have no idea how to function and they're just going to imperative code their little hearts out. The big thing here is you are opening the ability for people to cheat on the take-home code tests. People are cheating in video interviews too, and so there's a lot you have to watch out for, but you are opening yourself up to that vulnerability here. Pair programming interviews are my favorite. And I like this a lot because it takes a lot of the pressure off the candidate. Interviewing is really, really stressful, and not everybody is a great interviewer. And so you can miss out on talented people because they just get frazzled or just, their brains go blank. And so that's why pair programming interviews are really great. To effectively conduct a pair programming interview, the interviewer is the driver. So they're the one typing, and they are simply waiting for the interviewee to tell them what to do. So the goal here would be to describe a feature and how it should work. Then the interviewee can describe to them how to implement. And so this is really great. You get to hear their thought process, how they walk through problem solving, but then you also get an insight into how they communicate and how they describe things to other people. Because I've had developers that, are decent Angular developers, but the second you ask them why they are injecting that into their constructor or doing this or doing that, they have no idea. It's just the thing they do, versus being able to say, I'm doing this because, and this is the desired intent. And that's a skill that will help you scale teams because they can share knowledge. So if you can have a candidate walk through that exercise, maybe they blow right through it. This is a really great opportunity to talk about performance tuning, or maybe refactoring it to be abstracted for a different feature or something like that. So pair programming interviews are really, really great opportunities. And then finally, building interview questions. And I like this approach because if you are anything like me, where you are a manager or director, you have too many things on your plate at any given time, you need a really quick way to be able to assess candidates that doesn't take a lot of preparation time up front, but gives you a really good sense of things. You can do what I call building interview questions. And this is where I start really, really abstract with a candidate. It could be something, as open as, hey, tell me about your Angular journey. How did you get into Angular? What are the projects you've been working on? And they kind of can start talking about things. And then I'm listening for different technical things and taking notes of that. And so as they're mentioning these things, I will go and dive into them. And it's pretty quick. Like if you hear a candidate mention something, you can do kind of a deep dive. Well, why did you make that decision? And either they're like, well, we made the decision because this, or, oh, well, I wasn't the decision maker. Somebody else said this, so we all did that. And you can really quickly tell, exactly where their competency and their experience is. And then you can have a few key phrases that you're listening for. For me, the dividing question is the async pipe. And like probably at least 80% of developers that I interview are just either like deer in headlights, have never heard of the async pipe before, or they can kind of regurgitate like a description of it, but to the point that I can tell they've never implemented it or chosen to implement it because they understand the power of it. And so I never ever say async pipe in an interview. What I do is I ask them leading questions. If I'm asking them to describe to me how they would, iterate through data that they got from an API request, and list that in the browser, they're going to, start describing that. And I'll start asking questions about, oh, well, how do you manage cleaning up that observable? Is there a different way that you might do this? And I'm trying to lead them to that, to bring it up, but I'm never going to directly say it or ask them to define it, because that's not going to give you any valuable information. The other thing this is going to give you is an ability to kind of press further. I've had people be able to really, do a great job of parroting ng concepts. But the second I go more in depth and I start asking them about effects or why they would do this or how they would handle this one situation, they crumple. And so you can kind of suss out the people who've done like an interview guide, like memorization session before, versus whether they've actually ever applied that knowledge. So I can, get a lot of information from a candidate in about 30 minutes without ever seeing them write a line of code, just by following this format. Regardless of what format you choose, you want to make sure to touch on a few key skill areas. So obviously we care about Angular, TypeScript, and RxJS, but I've interviewed candidates where I asked them to rate themselves on each of these three things. And they're like, oh, well, I've never used RxJS. And I was like, oh, honey, if you've used the router or HTTP client, you just don't know it. And there are people like that out there that they've written Angular code, but they have no idea. So those are things that you want to kind of make sure they have at least somewhat awareness of. It's also a good idea to just touch on their basic JavaScript knowledge. I've definitely talked to people on clients or interviewed people who thought that the spread operator comes from NGRX because that's the first time they've encountered it before. And so they just associate it with that. So you want to kind of just touch briefly on their knowledge there. You don't have to go DOM manipulation, but just like, do they know what TypeScript is versus JavaScript versus what's offered by libraries? It's also a good idea to kind of push at their ecosystem knowledge. I like to ask open-ended questions about state management. What approaches have you used? Or if I'm asking about, mobile support, kind of letting them tell me what's going on and what they're aware of. But are they aware of all the tooling that we have available to us, where if they encounter a problem, they will know to go out and look for something instead of reinventing the wheel? Or have they just written a little bit of Angular and that's their very narrow scope that they've dealt in? It's also a good idea to at least touch on front-end skills. Do they know what semantic HTML is? We've come a long way with design systems and web component libraries and a lot of really great reusable things, but sometimes in that we lose that base understanding of what does semantic HTML really mean? How do we ensure that we're writing accessible code? And so these are things that you're going to want to care about instead of just drilling down on Angular knowledge. It's also a good idea to touch on version control, branching, PR review processes. I had a client hire a senior candidate, and then in conversations, at some point, the senior candidate was like, well, I don't know how to get the latest code from the feature branch into my branch. And I was like, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, here we go. So just gauge their experience and understanding there, so at least you know. And it's not a bad idea to ask about preferred tooling either. It's always a good sign to me when people are, hey, I prefer this tool because I like to do this, or I've had to solve this problem, or I hate memorizing NX commands, so I really like the VS Code plugin for it, that kind of thing. But if they're able to speak about their tooling, that's a really easy way for you to honestly gauge their experience. It's funny, even like me screen sharing with a client, I can pretty quickly assess their skill just based on the way they use their IDE and how they navigate for files for their proficiency level. So there's a lot you can learn just by talking tooling. All right, so on that note, let's talk about spotting skill gaps, because maybe you're in a situation where you aren't in control of the interview process. Maybe you're in charge of a new team, a whole bunch of things that can happen. And so to have an effectively scaling team, you need to know where those team skill levels are at and spot deficiencies so you can get people training and coaching that they need. So you need to be able to do these things quickly. All right, so number one, you need to fix your project management. And this is a harsh truth. You're not going to be able to tell true productivity of your engineers until you have good project management in place. Because if deadlines are always changing, you can't track milestones, you can't track output, you can't track, whether there are bottlenecks if you do not have good project management. All you're going to have is your gut. So having really good project management in place that makes it easy for developers to just do their jobs is going to give you better insight. I've had a lot of clients that were in such chaotic environments that, they had a senior engineer that has maybe opened one PR in 6 months. And that PR was like one line of code. And because they had so much chaos, nobody was able to spot this person was bringing no value and, basically just collecting a paycheck for doing nothing. And I don't want to say that like this person was a slacker or anything. They just had not been empowered. They weren't at the technical level enough, but nobody was calling on them. Nobody spotted it as a problem because project management was in such disarray. So you need to fix this. One of the things that we've started implementing on a lot of our clients, especially, we're consultants, so we walk into situations where we're like, well, we're told these people are senior, but they might not really be. We have a process we prefer processes of having work in progress PRs opened. So as soon as a developer takes on a task, takes on an issue, they create a branch, whatever your branching strategy is, and then, open a PR against that and mark it as work in progress. So the thing you want to do here is make sure that people are committing code at the end of every day. That's just, best practices, but it's a very tangible way for you to be able to see actual output somebody is doing. It's also a way for you to spot code quality issues faster. Maybe somebody is new to the code base and they are reinventing the wheel simply because they don't know that component has been built elsewhere that they can just kind of copy from or abstract. You can spot things like that. And this also gives you a really easy opportunity for pair programming. If somebody jumps in, they're like, hey, I'm noticing these things happening that aren't really following some good patterns. Let's jump on, let's pair through the rest of this waiting until all the work gets completed and then having to do a complete refactor. One of the other things that you want to do for spotting skill gaps is promote and encourage question asking. Do not shame question asking. The quicker people ask questions when they're stuck, the quicker you can get a sense of what they may or may not know, what your process needs to improve, so you can make sure that they're getting the education and the coaching and the mentoring that they need. And so if you're shutting people down or getting mad at them for asking questions, they are just going to silently not produce. And then you're not going to know what's going on. You're going to have no insight and no ability to help them. It's also really important for spotting skill gaps quickly to have an onboarding system, because if you're throwing new people into your code base and they don't have enough information to get started, you're never going to be able to really determine where they're at or where they might need help. So, if you put a new developer, a new hire on your project tomorrow, are they going to be able to tell you what the vision of the product is or who the users are? Are they going to be able to know or tell you why certain technical decisions have been made, like why the team is using a micro front-end approach? How quickly are they able to get set up in their environments? Like how quickly should they be able to get up and running? Do they know the process? If they're told, hey, you go do this thing, do they know how to take that all the way through your process from writing the code to getting it approved to getting it deployed? How quickly should they be able to submit that first PR? If you can't answer these questions off the top of your head, you need to look at your onboarding process, because if you don't have these things in place, it's going to be really, really hard for you to gauge how successful candidates are going to be. Along with this, you need to really look at reducing blockers, dealing with those, or you're going to get sucked into an excuses game where stuff isn't getting delivered, deadlines aren't being met, and you're like, well, why isn't this getting done? What is happening? Oh, well, I couldn't do it because of this thing. Oh, well, I couldn't do it because of this thing. So you need to pay attention to your blockers and make sure those are getting removed, so you can get a true understanding of the productivity of your team members. All right. So our last big thing here that we need to discuss for scaling teams is, you've interviewed, you have an understanding of where people are, whether they're experts, whether they're all juniors. You need to create a growth environment. And this is really critical. And this is a mistake we see time and time again, where the team has that one developer, they know everything, they've been around the longest, they're really, really competent. And, typically managers or Scrum Masters get blinded by the short-term speed gains they get by throwing all the scary stuff at that one engineer. But the second that person leaves, this project is just unable to maintain. And I see this time and time again on clients where we walk into a situation where they had that one expert they were relying on. That person walks out the door and everything is in disarray. And so you need to really focus on getting away from that and distributing information and expertise among the team. So part of this, you need to understand your team member limitations. Like, how many seasoned team members do you have? What does their capacity look like? Is it a brand new team? What do your juniors look like? Are you coming into an existing team? And get the lay of the land. From there, your number one priority needs to be knowledge spreading. And I feel like this is something that doesn't happen because management or leadership refuses to carve out time from feature delivery and deadlines to make sure that team members can focus on mentoring and knowledge spreading and ensuring they're not just taking the quick path of putting all the hard stuff on one person, but dispelling knowledge as best they can. So there are a couple ways that you can do this at the team level. Number one is you can create KPIs around this. If you have some sort of system where you have reviews and those are tied into performance, don't make them just based around delivery. Make them based around, team member knowledge sharing, collaboration. These are things that you need to call out and make a part of your culture, even at a monetary level, for engineers to be able to prioritize this on their own. It's also a good idea to assign directly responsible individuals for different things. Maintaining onboarding and documentation is an ongoing process. And, this is something that we see time and time again as consultants. We're coming to clients. They don't have anything documented around onboarding. So we have to figure out what's going on and then update the documentation instead of letting somebody else sit there for 3 weeks, not knowing how to get their environment up and running because they don't understand how to configure certificates to work with the back end. So having somebody who's always in charge of onboarding puts them in that boat of, oh, hey, this person asked this question. We made this change and it didn't make it into the onboarding documentation. I need to own making sure that happens. The same with PR review processes. If you're using Storybook or any sort of documentation tools, having somebody responsible for making sure those are owned and updated can be really, really helpful, especially if you are in the engineering manager camp where you don't have time to do all these things. Empower your team to take responsibility here. You also want to do your best to set up mentoring practices. And I want to call out two different kinds because sometimes this mentoring word can sound intimidating. Oh, I don't have time for that. So if you can encourage this idea of passive mentoring, and this is activities like PR reviews, leaving comments, kind of educating people that way, answering questions in Slack. These are all positive, actual mentoring things that you need to call out and encourage. And then, of course, there's active mentoring, which is, something like leading a knowledge sharing session or actively offering pair programming. On the note of pair programming, it's a really good idea to start forcing this. Make people spend time together. And even the most expert developers on your team are going to learn stuff from each other. My guys do this all the time where, they'll just be randomly brainstorming an idea and they'll be like, oh man, I didn't even think about that approach. There's so much to be gained by doing this at every level. So for starters, you can do a scheduled rotation. Maybe you take the most senior person on your team with the most junior person on your team and say, hey, spend an hour together this week. I don't care what the topic is. Senior person, you come up with that. Go. Make it happen. And also make vulnerability and not knowing things okay. Pair programming scares people because it's scary to type in front of somebody else and maybe you, don't know everything and you don't want somebody else to know that. Make that vulnerability and not knowing things okay as a part of your culture and you'll see more growth. Do one, see one, teach one is another great way that you can encourage mentoring. So if somebody solves a problem and somebody else encounters that same problem, and they go and ask that first person, well, how'd you solve this? Have that person teach them. The next time somebody encounters it, don't have them go to the original person, but to the person that learned. And so every time somebody's encountering this problem, the most recent person to encounter it needs to be that one to coach the next person through. Bonus points if you get that in documentation, but baby steps, right? All right. I want to give you a couple like freebies that are really, really easy to implement, because if you're looking at this, it can seem overwhelming, but there's some super easy things you can do. Use PRs as documentation. If you've got a PR from somebody new in the code base where you answer a lot of the things, bookmark that and save it for a later conversation. So that way the next person that comes on has these same issues. You can point them to this PR and be like, hey, look at what we did here. You can also pull code directly out of those PRs into wikis to create documentation for code smells and best practices. And it does not take the time and mental energy that it would coming up with this from scratch. Also use PRs as coaching mechanisms. If a PR requires more than 5 comments, and I'm talking like real comments, not like nitpicky linting stuff, because hopefully you have a linter catching that. Encourage people to just jump into a pairing session and discuss issues instead of just redlining a PR. Just stop it at that point and say, hey, I think this would be more effective if we jumped on a call and talked through. One of the really active things that I recommend doing is creating learning sessions, weekly sessions, and make them mandatory. Make people show up to this. It's a great way to get people talking about different topics, talking about problems they've solved. And if you don't have people that are volunteering, maybe you got a really junior team, assign research topics. My team members are always really grateful when I'm like, hey, this thing, you used it briefly here, go do a deep dive and teach the rest of the team. It gets you out of that, hey, just make it work mindset into how does it work and how can I really empower us to use this effectively? And so assigning research topics can be a really great way to kind of inspire people to go down that path. And then finally, for creating a growth environment, you need to solicit feedback, because you've got a lot of things going on. And so by having conversations, asking your team members, hey, what can we do to better onboard people? How can we better scale up people? Take their ideas and use your power to transform that into policy and to really start encouraging this growth mindset. The big thing here is, we can't keep relying on hiring just senior engineers. You need to build at your company level people who are going to continue to grow and push themselves and push each other. And that's how you're truly going to be able to scale. All right, so in summary, senior talent bidding war is brutal. It's not a game you want to play, and it's not an effective strategy. It's a good idea to review your interview process, consider trying some different strategies, see what works best for you, and make sure that you're getting a good idea of the candidates coming in. Create systems to spot skill gaps. The quicker you can spot these skill gaps among your team members, the quicker you can get them help and in the right direction to be, meeting the goals that you care about. And number one that you should be focused on is prioritizing, facilitating growth and mentoring. This is hard work. This is not easy. It requires dedication. It requires diligence and continuous pushing. This is not something that you just do once and then walk away from. It's hard work that takes perseverance, but it is a pathway to success. And it is a great way to create an environment where your teams will scale and your company will not suffer when these bidding wars happen, because you've built a self-sustaining growth model that is going to continue your team to get better and teach and coach each other and more effectively bring more junior people in the door. That's all I have for you today. I hope this was helpful. These slides are available at scalingengineeringteams.jenniferwadella.com. If you need help with this, or if you just need more grownups in the room, which I've heard from my clients before, my company Batovi is available to come in and help you do this. If you just need those couple people to kind of champion and get things going in the right direction, that's the kind of work we really love doing and kind of coaching and mentoring as we go. That's all I have for you. I think we might be doing some Q&A in a panel or the chat later, but I hope you have a great rest of your conference and hope to see you all again in person someday.
Hi, I'm Joe Weems. Thanks for checking out this video from EnterpriseNG 2021. Online conferences were great, but it's time to get back in person. See your old friends, make some new ones, and take your career to the next level. Head over to ng-conf.org to get your ticket. See you there.